Good evening. My name is Michael Denisha. I'm the Director of Research for the John Bradamus Center at NYU, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all for tonight's discussion of civility in the news media and social media. This is the fourth in our series of conversations in what we've been calling the Civility Project. We began this initiative after the events of January 6th to try to get a better understanding of how civil dialogue and civil interaction in our body politic has been steadily breaking down, and to see if there are any paths leading out of this dilemma. But these conversations have also been a real interrogation of the concept of civility, why it is important to making the democratic process work, but just as importantly, how it's been abused, how it's been misused, where it's been wielded as a club to shut down debates, to divine who is in and who is out of the political community, who has power and who doesn't. Which leads us to this evening's conversation on civility in social media and news media. And this has been in the planning for many months, but of course, given the headlines of the past few weeks, it's taken on an even greater urgency. I'd like to thank the J.M. Kaplan Fund and the Center's Advisory Council for their support of this project, and especially Ellen Toscano, a member of the council who's been leading this project with me. I'd also like to thank Nessa Rappaport, Polly Tertzian, and Tom McIntyre, who are doing so much of the work behind the scenes to make this possible. Before I introduce our moderator for this evening, I wanted to note one item. Unfortunately, one of the scheduled panelists will not be able to join us tonight. Sarah Sobieraj is a professor at Tufts, where a bomb threat was called into its diversity office this afternoon, shutting down the campus. As Sarah said in a message to me, my apologies for this unbelievable situation and the bleak world we are all navigating, but this work is ever more important. Now, to lead us through this evening's discussion, we could not have found a better guide. Chenjerai Kumanyika is a scholar, a journalist, an artist, a storyteller. He is assistant professor of journalism here at NYU. Alongside his scholarship and teaching and his work on the intersections of social justice and media, he specializes in using narrative nonfiction audio journalism to critique the ideology around American historical myths about issues such as race, the Civil War, and policing. His work has appeared in numerous scholarly and journalistic venues such as Popular Music and Society, The Intercept, NPR Code Switch, All Things Considered, Invisibilia, and Vice. He is co-creator, co-executive producer, and co-host of Uncivil, very on brand for us tonight, a podcast on the Civil War. He's collaborated with Scene on Radio for their seasons on Seeing White and on the history of American democracy. His work has been recognized with numerous honors, including the George Foster Peabody Award for Uncivil, the Media Literate Media Award for Scene on Radio, and the Union of Democratic Communications Dallas Smythe Award for his career accomplishments and advocacy. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn this evening over to our moderator, Chenjerai Kumanyika.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome. I just want to say I'm so excited that we're going to have this conversation, and I really want to thank everyone at the Bradamus Center who has taken time to put this together. I also want to thank our panelists and everyone who's tuning in. You know, these are really busy times, and, you know, I think even part of the topic of this panel involves looking at, you know, ways that we need spaces to kind of slow down and talk about certain things. And so I'm so glad we're going to have that. I just want to take a minute to introduce our tremendous panelists that we have. We have, you know, Imran Ahmed is the founder and CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. Imran was inspired to start the center after seeing the rise of anti-Semitism on the left in the United Kingdom and the murder of his colleague Joe Cox MP by a white supremacist who had been radicalized in part online during the EU referendum in 2016. He holds an MA in Social and Political Sciences from the University of Cambridge. He's an authority on social and psychological malignancies on social media, and he advises politicians around the world on policy and legislation. So we're really excited to have Imran with us. We also have Paul Cheung, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Public Integrity. As the CEO, he leads efforts to reverse the effects of inequalities with investigative journalism. Previously, he managed a multi-million-dollar investment portfolio at the Knight Foundation to scale the use of artificial intelligence, improve business sustainability solutions, and combat misinformation. He's a graduate of New York University and Columbia Sulzberger Leadership Program. So we're also really excited to have Paul. So what we're going to do is I'm going to offer a few brief words, and then we're going to have our panelists, offer some really interesting and important insights. And then we're going to turn to a Q&A. And I'd really encourage you all to, as soon as you start hearing things that spark your, interest and imagination, and questions, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom to post those questions, and we'll address them after our panelists have made their comments. And with that, we'll kind of get started. One thing I just want to say, like on this topic of civility, I was so excited that we're going to get this space to talk about it, as opposed to like a debate on Twitter, which is a place where I've seen a lot of this stuff play out, right? Or other social media platforms, or, sometimes like at the site of a protest, right? It's kind of like it's not the best time, right, to sit and have a really measured deliberation. But I just want to say I've watched with, as a public scholar who deals with issues of social justice, I've watched with tremendous interest as the concept of civility has gained more attention and discussion. Now, I should say at the outset that, we live in times where feelings of outrage and hopelessness are fully understandable. And yet, I believe that there are both ethical and strategic reasons to double down on the need for good faith, respectful deliberation, and even for treating those we disagree with the most with the basics of human dignity. Now, having said that, there's been some times when I've been worried about how the concept of civility is deployed. And I want to sort of outline 3 areas where, I've been worried and that I think make the concept of civility important, but complicated. One is that, there are some very violent and uncivil policies that proceed through very respectful procedures and conversations. As somebody who attends to the history, of America around race, I'm aware that there was a lot of violence that got done while people were just kind of sitting with tea or sitting with, through pencils and pens, and things like that, that often don't get narrated as violence. And so I think what my takeaway from that when we talk about civility is that how can we have a definition of civility that sort of at least unmasks that kind of violence, right? As it unfolds. I mean, we've certainly, I think, seen examples of that. I mean, this is my opinion. I'm not speaking for everybody here, but I think we've seen some violence for that in the last decade in certain presidential administrations, et cetera. So that's one sort of puzzle about civility there, right? Like, important to be respectful, but what winds up counting as civility? Is it just about the manner in which we communicate, or is the content of what's happening also important, right, and up for discussion? A second thing that I think is that important and related to that is that some discussions of civility in moments when we're identifying someone as maybe being uncivil, some of those moments assume that there's like a backdrop of respectful nonviolence, and that I'm not sure is always attendant to the circumstances that's happening, right? I just look at different times, in history, not just in the United States, but really around the world, where people who are enduring, uncivil lives, uncivil scenarios, uncivil conditions are then asked to endure that and sort of appear as though that's not happening. And then when they reflect that in certain ways, they're pointed out as the problem, without considering the entire context. So I think that that's another puzzle of civility. Again, I think it's important to be respectful, but I just think that's a puzzle that we have to wrestle with. And the last thing is that, and this is sort of also related, is that one of the ways that the powerful sort of enforce, I think regimes of inequality on more vulnerable people is by basically telling you that you're not allowed to be angry. You're not allowed to express rage. You're not allowed to have emotions, and so it actually, I just have just thinking about so much feminist literature I've read where people have said it was a real accomplishment of their ability to fully be in themselves and fully participate in the world, to even acknowledge their own rage and emotion, right? So I think that that plays a role, right? This isn't to say, again, this isn't to sort of just authorize that as the way that we proceed forward with democracy, but it is to say that we have to think, as we talk about civility, I think we have to really attend in a fairly compassionate way to what is the role of emotion and rage, right? And where might it be necessary to create spaces where people can air that, and actually what is it, how is it incumbent on us actually in the moments when people appear to being uncivil to really try to understand what is given rise to that, right? So those are all just a few puzzles that I think I want to toss into the mix. But even with those concerns I just laid out, the problem with a lot of the dominant ways civility gets discussed is that it does kind of focus on individual instances, our choices about communication, our utterances, whether they're in person, whether they are what we're writing online, right? A lot of the conversation focuses on those utterances as the sites of struggle. And what is not given, I think, sufficient attention is the environments in which we are having these kinds of conversations, right? The environments that structure civility, sort of often, one could say underneath our noses or beyond our immediate sight. And I think that certainly as a journalist, thinking about journalistic platforms, the shifts, the tremendous changes that I've lived through, that really anybody who's has been alive and paying attention for the last couple of decades has gone through. We've seen a tremendous shift in the environments in which things happen. And this is not just simply the emergence of the platforms, what we communicate on, but the business and political economy behind that, right? The business models, and certainly the technology itself. There's so much going on that I think it's hard to keep up with. And these things are maybe not the sort of sexiest aspect of civility to talk about, but I think they are deeply important because we may find that they have a tremendous impact on our ability to sort of do what we need to do in the space of civility, in the space of democracy and respectful deliberation. So I don't want to say anything else because we got some actual experts on this in the building. And I want to now turn with that to Paul Cheung, and he's going to offer us some thoughts on, how I think news and the history of news and all of these issues. Paul, welcome to our discussion.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me back to NYU, where I actually majored in journalism and did something with my major. I think the question of civility and facts is super interesting because as a person of color, civility is often used against communities of colors, right? Think about how many times we've been called uncivilized, especially in the colonial days, right? We're not able to go into certain restaurants because we're just not civilized people who drink tea and scone in a certain way. So I think that's super interesting. Now, in context of sort of like the news, is really funny because when we think about civility and news, I don't even understand why people think there is civility in news in general, right? When we think about the evolution of news media, if you sort of go back like 100 years or 200 years, news was really born from really political tension, right? It's being used as a way to advocate a policy standpoint, a sort of a point of view. And most of these newspapers weren't independent. They all were basically political vehicle for ruling family and the ruling class to sort of disseminate their policy and their thinking. And that has sort of lasted on. So when you think about sort of news evolution, you can't actually divorce news from technology because each time you have a technological shift, that news sort of change and the business model have changed. So in the early days, right, before the printing press, like news is really done as book form. So it's really for limited, again, the ruling class. The minute the printing press sort of came on board is the people who can read that become, the people who are consuming it. Again, is really used as a way, not what we think about today in terms of like informing and engaging sort of community, is really sort of advocacy, right? The early form of news is to advocate for political policy, a particular candidate of sort. And then as the platform shift, right, the onset of the broadcast, which is the radio environment, the TV environment, that have changed the news again, right? And when you think about some of the most revered newspaper people that you think about, Hearst, right? Pulitzer, which is like every year, like, the best of journalism win Pulitzer. If you were to actually make Pulitzer back in the days, then Pulitzer and Hearst were the pioneer of yellow journalism, right? Yellow journalism is basically sensational journalism, is not grounding in truth, right? It's really grounded with, a lot of the biased story that get presented as objective truth, when in fact it's like half fiction, half truth. Why are they doing it? Because they realize that people want to consume content. They want to consume content that elicit emotions. They want to consume content that sort of elicit these strong sort of like emotions and feelings. And so the only way to do it is you have to present news as a drama, right? So that was actually, the period of time where news had gotten really big because people could make money off that. And the reason they could do it is because the printing press had gotten so prolific and newspaper gotten so cheap that anyone who could read could afford a newspaper. And that's basically the cheapest form of entertainment, right? So that's really sort of like, when you think about that evolution of news, that's basically the first seismic shift, right? And then after sort of the yellow journalism, you have basically what we think about the marketing of news as objective is actually quite recent as a business model, right? Because by then you want to differentiate yourself, right? So a lot of news organizations are suddenly sort of thinking about, how do we differentiate? We present the truth, we become the facts, right? We ask the 5W, right? And that come the era of sort of like Walter Cronkite and some of these very romanticized version of broadcast medium, right? So I think from that point, news sort of took on that space of the conversation facilitator, right? So no longer are they taking on sort of policies, but their position of power hasn't changed, right? They become the person who disseminate information to the person who are dictating the conversation of the day, right? Because think about when you consume news in the sort of like 60s, 70s, and 80s, is you go home and you consume news at, the afternoon, you consume news sort of like immediately after work. Your newspaper come out maybe twice a day, right? We have, back in the old days, it's sort of like an evening press and a morning press. So the newspaper sort of becomes sort of like the conversation starter. They're the one who curate the agenda of the day. They're the one who tell you what is it that you should be talking about and what is it that you shouldn't, right? And so again, that was a space that news really occupied for a big chunk of the 19th century, right? And then things change again with cable news. The minute that 24 hours, cycle come in, news have shifted again from being this facilitator of conversation to back into entertainment. Think about sort of when CNN got really popular. Do anyone remember when CNN got really popular? It's because of one incident. If you guys know the incident, feel free to just put that in your Q&A, right? It's OJ. I remember I was at NYU, I was an undergrad, and then what do? We just basically look at a car driving in LA for like an hour. That was news, right? So really, Ted Turner and CNN had changed and revolutionized the way people think about news, and news now become a 24-hour thing in television, right? And literally, I don't know who wants to consume news every hour on the hour. And so in order for these companies to make a return on profit, they have to rethink about the news formula, right? What is the business model? Could they really truly be objective? And especially now when you look at TV, whether it's CNN or Fox or MSNBC, how many of you actually understand the difference between an anchor, a host, a commentator, an analyst, and a reporter, right? And if you know the difference, please, put your answer in the Q&A. If you don't, I'd be more than happy to answer them. So a lot of times, like, people actually don't even know who is doing the reporting, because all you're seeing is these talking heads in the news channel, right? So that's from the television space. Now, when the digital disruption happened, again, news have followed the print news have followed the TV news, just like the digital disruption. Sorry. With the way the internet is, it disrupted the news business again. Now news could be 24 hours. And so the way we think about the news model, now we have this phase of like mass industrialization of news, right? News become a commodity. It's no, sorry. News have become such a commodity because you could get it anywhere, anytime, in any device, right? Whether it's from your phone, from your television, from your laptop, from your, even when you go to the gym, run on treadmill, you can see the news. So when you think about the mass industrialization of news, literally, there's not that much news that like anyone could consume. So you end up seeing the same thing again and again. So what is the formula that a lot of news are using? Is really, how do we pit sort of like the good versus evil, right? The who's right, who's wrong. And so that's what you see news are doing. So when we think about, some of the civility question around news, we tend to pinpoint social media as the problem. It's not just social media is the problem. Social media allow for the silos and the anger to spread faster and quicker. But let's not get it twisted. The hatred and the biases has been in news all along. Nothing have changed. Technology basically provided a way to make it happen faster and quicker, right? So, and that's what happened when you see the social media platform. Suddenly they're able to sort of like take what's going on in news and be able to silo it into these communities, right? So if you come from a certain political blend versus a different political spectrum, you end up creating these echo chamber, right? But you have to think about, who is responsible for the echo chamber? Is it really the social media, or what is the role of news play in this echo chamber creation, right? If we didn't fume it, there is nothing to amplify, right? And so that's where I see sort of news tie in. Now, with social media technology, this basically created this perfect storm, right? With the decline of traditional news, sort of losing money, they have to rethink about the business model. They rely on more social media. They have to print on more content, right? So, whether it's Google or Facebook or sort of Twitter, you have to think about what is the headline that really grabs your attention? What is the thing that will keep you continuously scrolling and consuming the content, right? And the way this technology facilitated is this perfect storm where we allow for more disinformation, more misinformation to proliferate in ways that we haven't seen before. And again, mis and disinformation sort of been with us all the time, but just right now, it's just happening at a pace that is much quicker, right? It's really harder to stop and detect. And so when we think about what is it that we could do in terms of looking ahead, I think with the way the meltdown of Elon Musk and Twitter, and I don't know even who's on Facebook anymore, is this the beginning of the end of Web 2, right? Which is centralized social platform, and to sort of Web 3, which tend to be more decentralized. Now, with a decentralized way of thinking about technology, what is the impact on news? And could news actually return to its role of being the sort of facilitator of conversation, rather than the one who's sort of dictating what is the agenda of the day. Or right now, what we are doing is sort of like creating these echo chamber by the two-sideism, right? Like anytime you read news, like the formula is you get the perspective of one, you get the perspective of another, right? And that's where a lot of news are presenting themselves. But I would say, for a lot of places, we are moving away from that. As CPI, our mission is about fighting inequality. There's only one side to that. You're either against inequality or you're for inequality. And we basically are not going to care about anyone who's for inequality because fundamentally we think that's wrong. So, that's basically my thoughts in terms of, in summarizing is news and technology is you can't decouple the two, right? When you think about some of these conversations, they've been there all along, except that technology basically provide the speed and reach in ways that news couldn't accomplish in the past.
Wow, thank you so much, Paul. I just saw that as soon as you started talking, I saw people popping in with questions, and I really appreciate just the way you're helping us describe these changes. I mean, it's really, I think it's important to slow down. We don't know, we've gone through a change, but what is the character? Is it faster? Is it a narrative of decay? Where we were really civil before and now we're not, So I think this is all great. I have a number of questions, but I'm going to turn to Imran and let Imran also weigh in. And I think Imran is going to turn more specifically to topics of social media. So welcome to the conversation, Imran.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Imran Ahmed. I'm Chief Executive of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is a US-based organization that exposes the proliferation of hate and disinformation primarily in digital spaces, tries to understand the harm that causes in our real world, and also campaigns to create costs for the spread and the production of hate and disinformation. I'll start by saying that I personally felt it was incredibly incivil to talk about tea so pejoratively at the start of both of your presentations. As an Englishman, I'm starting to feel like there's a class issue here. But beyond that, thank you for taking us through those thoughts. I mean, mine are quite disconnected, and I wonder if the third participant might have been able to connect it more. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how social media has changed the way in which we conduct discourse. Because that was something that I learned, as Chenjerai said, very early on in 2016, when I was working in the British Parliament as a special advisor to the leader of the Remain campaign for the Labour Party in that EU referendum for a guy called Alan Johnson. And in that campaign, we saw that disinformation and hate narratives against Muslims, Blacks, Jews, and disinformation about the election process, about a lot of things that have become very familiar tropes of how our democracy is conducted these days, were really scarring the conduct of that election. It was becoming fever pitched. People were saying things and we just didn't understand where these ideas and conspiracies were coming from, where these narratives of hatred were coming from. And it was towards the end of that campaign that my colleague, Jo Cox, who was a brilliant woman, fantastically intelligent, fantastically caring, a mother of two, was shot, stabbed and beaten to death on the streets of her constituency in Batley and Spen in Northern England. And besides breaking my heart, it taught me a really important lesson, that the man who killed her, Thomas Mayer, shouted "Britain first, death to traitors," as he killed her. Britain First was the name of the first political movement to achieve 1 million likes on Facebook. It'd done that about 2 years earlier. And when I was told by a colleague that there was something on Facebook that had 1 million likes, some kind of crazy anti-Black, anti-Muslim organization, I remember saying to him, who gives a shit? They've got 1 million clicks. We've got 500,000 members. They're nothing. And I was wrong. Profoundly wrong. Because what we had missed was that the primary locus of information exchange of the negotiation of our social mores, the norms of attitude and behavior, of our values as a society, the values that sustain our democracy, of course. Even the negotiation of the corpus of information that we call facts has shifted to digital spaces, to Facebook groups, to Twitter, to Reddit, to spaces that in conventional places like politics, we just didn't understand them. We didn't accept for a moment that these could possibly be the places where facts are decided, because they're decided in constituency meetings, aren't they? Or on the pages of the Times or the Guardian. And that was nonsense. I mean, Paul posed the question, does anyone still use Facebook? 3 billion people as of July 2022. 2 billion daily users. It is still, I mean, because a lot of the, in fact, in about 28 minutes, we have a new report coming out on TikTok. And that's kind of the sexy new platform, isn't it? Everyone's talking about it because it's used by a lot of young people. But Facebook remains the £800 gorilla in our information ecosystem. The algorithms that determine what succeeds on Facebook have more influence on humanity's understanding of each other and ourselves than any other company in human history, any news provider in human history. Those algorithms determine very much so what succeeds and what doesn't. And I mean that at a really fundamental level, because digital communications are to conventional communications platforms as the nuclear bomb is to the M16. They are completely different, operating on a different rules of physics. It's the scale, it's the nature of the way of the economics that underpin these platforms too. So Paul masterfully took us through a history of how communications had been controlled and the technology that underpinned the dissemination of information. But there's also the economics of it. So the printing press, of course, the great thing was the economic revolution that it inaugured, allowing the broadening of those who control the means of production of communications. Social media is again like the nuclear age, because it's the production of almost unlimited amounts of communication for zero marginal cost for every additional message to every additional person. From nothing, you can consume everything. A message can be received by billions of people for the same cost as one person. And that fundamentally changes the nature of it, because of course then the game becomes, how do I game the algorithm? How do I make the system work for me? It becomes like a role-playing game almost, trying to work out how to make the system work. It's not about the quality of your arguments. It's not about the facts within. It's about whether or not you've managed to make the algorithm amplify your content to as many people as possible so you can get the eyeballs to it. And here's the second part of the economic argument, that because this is entirely advertising funded, it is just about the eyeballs. How many eyeballs can you get there and how much can I sell them for? And these changes in the economics, these changes in the physics of how communications happen, of to what scale an individual piece of communication can achieve, if it's able to game the algorithm, has fundamentally changed the way that we think. Engagement is the key, you see. What makes something succeed and what doesn't is how engaging it is. And I see a question in the questions about how do I make my positive message beat a negative message. Fundamentally, you can't as easily, because the system is asymmetric. It's weighted towards that which induces the most emotional reaction and therefore engagement. Here's the thing, that if I tweet something like, I really love puppies, I do, but I might get a few likes, generally from quite weird people like my sister, who's obsessed with puppies. Or if I tweet something about how much I hate puppies, well, then loads of people would say, what's wrong with you, you sicko? People would retweet me and go, oh my God, that guy from the CCDH really hates puppies. I told you he was horrible. Suddenly people start piling on. That's engagement. And actually that message will be amplified to lots more timelines, because the the system recognizes that this is inducing reaction and it starts to amplify it. Now, that's a really glib example. Let me give you the macro example of it. When Facebook studied its impact on politics, it went and asked political parties across Europe what messages were and weren't working on their platform, because they wanted to understand if they were changing the nature of democratic politics. This was all revealed in the Haugen revelations. Facebook never made this public at all, nor would they want to make this public, because the results were terrifying. The results were that negative political campaigning were the only things that worked on their platform. And so political parties had to change their messaging. It became about negative partisanship, which is how much you hate the other side, rather than positive partisanship, which is about how much you love your side. The only party in Poland, which is one of the countries in which they did the study, that appreciated this, that said this was a good thing for them, was the neo-Nazi party. Of course they did, because they hate everyone, apart from, I don't know, people with blue eyes and blonde hair. But that's the devastating impact of how the rules of physics have changed, and why incivility, which is this really interesting concept to me, because incivility, as Chenjerai says, people like me and Chenjerai and Paul have had to be incivil by the standards of those who were dominant in order to, and we stand on the shoulders of those who were genuinely incivil to have a voice today. To be able to say that I went to the University of Cambridge and I'm speaking at an NYU event. People have had to be incivil and demand our rights to do so. This is about structural, systemic incivility built into the means by which we communicate, fundamentally changing the nature of what it is we believe to be true, even, because the messages that succeed are the ones that are most angry. It becomes normal. Frequency bias is in our psychology. We see something more frequently, we think it's more normal, we think it's acceptable to believe it. It's how we've seen the radical and rapid renormalization, the resocialization of our societies to much more angry ways. I've seen it in the politics in my country on both left and right. It's not about Donald Trump. It's about the system. What links Modi to Duterte, to Bolsonaro, to Orbán, to the AfD, to the Front National, to Corbyn, to Trump, to Boris Johnson. The means by which they communicate favor the messages of anger and division. And that's fundamentally corrosive to journalism as well. I mean, think about it this way. Think about what works on Twitter if you were trying to promote your news story. It's the headline and how angry the headline is. And that means the spin in an article matters more than the facts within, which is an extraordinary thing. The way that changes the way that journalists think. If you want to be a successful journalist, and I'm a great fan of the news media, I think that the jobs that journalists do and the standards to which they hold themselves are incredibly powerful and potent for our society, but it is fundamentally corrosive to the way that they're forced to think. There's other things as well about social media platforms that make them so dangerous for us, that actually disinformation is also given an advantage on those platforms. And disinformation is not just not the truth. It is non-falsifiable stuff that cannot be disproved. You cannot disprove that Bill Gates is a lizard and that there is a conspiracy to cover up that he's a lizard. I mean, Chenjerai and Paul are pretty clever. Try it. Try and disprove that he's a lizard. There's a conspiracy to cover up that he's a lizard. It's impossible. You cannot disprove that doctors have been systematically lying to us about the vaccine because they're in it for themselves and they're getting paid off by Pfizer and Merck. Because how do you disprove it? And so actually, often disinformation is the ultimate example of incivility because it's a lack of respect for the concept of discourse and debate. The winner of a debate shouldn't ever be the person who, it shouldn't be one of the participants. It should always be the audience. Debate and discourse is edifying to the whole community. And we've lost that in not just the nature of how these platforms force us to communicate, but also in the form of how those communications happen, of how the discourse occurs there. There are very few deliberative spaces on social media, and it's very much about, function follows form, which is argument, then people shouting at you. And no capacity for much more collaborative, discursive spaces. I would also make the point about abuse, which I think is a really powerful way in which we are reshaping our society and what we're willing to say, because it changes the rules of the game for how journalists think about and how people who want to spread facts think about being able to spread facts. In the pandemic, I spent a ton of time working with journalists and also with vaccinologists who wanted to put out science, but they knew they couldn't because if they did, they'd get a ton of abuse. Abuse is used as a tool to reshape what people feel they can say. Abuse is purposeful communications designed to silence other people. Freedom of speech for an abuser means restricting the freedom of speech for their victims. And that's why it's really important that, for example, rules are enforced. We have rules in every aspect of discourse in our world. But the lack of rules on social media platforms, which is not about the fact that they don't have community standards, it's that they don't enforce them because they can't be bothered, because why should they? It's cheaper for them to do nothing and just allow the sort of the car crash to occur and monetize the attention devoted to the car crash. It would require them to start to develop a sort of journalistic ethics, an ethics of control of these platforms, which are so crucial to human discourse today, of how we decide the facts. But of course, that doesn't exist in that industry. It's all about the engagement. It's all about the eyeballs. It's all about the advertising, and it's all about the dollars in the end. And I think, the challenge for us is, of course, that if we fail to deal with this, that the edifices we built in society to protect epistemic weight, which is necessary in a complex society with a widespread division of labor, is being fundamentally undermined and shattered. It's causing the crisis of epistemic anxiety, which leads to more conspiracist thinking, which leads to the breakdown in trust, which leads to the breakdown in our capacity to sustain our democracies. And that has a species-wide effect. So, I know we started with this concept of civility, but structural systemic incivility and the lack of respect that they encourage, that the platforms that work to these new rules encourage us to adopt, actually do threaten everything, just as much as climate change, the destruction of our information ecosystem, and the civility that's coded into the practices, the systems that we have there, has a really, really significant effect. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Imran. I really just, really appreciate the comments. Let me just quickly say before I respond a little bit, everyone, please, now is a good time to get your questions in. We have a few in there, and we will answer your questions either by, just sort of voicing them, or in some cases, our panelists are responding directly in the Q&A. So please get your questions in there. Imran, I just want to thank you for this really personal aspect of your experience that you've shared related to this tragedy that happened to your colleague. It just shows that this is not purely theoretical for a kind of discussion, right? It's very real. I'm here in the Arthur Carter Institute of Journalism at NYU, and downstairs in my department, my colleague Salman Rushdie, didn't happen here, but he was attacked. It also brought things home in a very real way. So I think that, I really appreciate that. I have a question. I also just want to say to everyone who's watching this, you can even see in some of the questions that many of us, when we think about things related to civility, as we started out saying, we tend to think of the personal, like I'm trying to communicate, how can I get my message out? And I just want to thank our panelists for sort of broadening the scope and saying, there's really some other sites of struggle here, right? The site of struggle, right, has to be maybe a little bit on the structural, on the media environment, on what we think about in terms of news. Maybe, I don't know how people feel about public media. I think public media is important, especially here in the US, where it's really, unfortunately, struggling. And so I guess one question I want to pose to our panelists before I turn to the Q&A is this. I know that, Paul, you have done some work on looking at AI. And when we think about how to make this sort of structural changes, how to address these sort of altered physics that Imran talked about, one of the sort of paths that is often offered to us is that we just have to kind of fix the algorithm, or we just have to offer a better version of AI, and that we can somehow code our way out of these problems, right? And that is, I think, what's tempting about that is what both of you have kind of laid out. Like, if we know for sure that like somebody, you know, how does the expression say, you know, a lie can run a couple of laps around the world before the truth gets its boots on? If we know that the digital world has made that, you know what I'm saying, has kind of has amplified that, it is tempting to think, are there technological solutions? But I'm curious to see what you all think about that, because it strikes me that there's also could be some pitfalls in that way of thinking. So what either of you or both of you want to weigh in on that?
So in my prior job at night, I actually dealt with a lot of AI and ethical issues. And right now I'm also in University of Florida's Consortium for Technology. The thing with AI is developed by human, and as human, we are flawed, right? AI could only do as much as we have data input, right? So if there's flawed assumptions into the AI will do flawed things, right? You know, and then we see that happening with, I don't know if anyone remember the debacle of Cortana over Twitter, like with Microsoft, where like someone tricked Cortana to say really racist and anti-Semitic things because the AI was flawed. Now, there is a project that UF is working on that is really interesting and is really about the language. One thing that I sort of been thinking a lot about in terms of journalism is the words that we use, right? You know, technology has evolved, and so has the way we express ourselves and the way we consume ourselves. But I feel like what journalism does is we're still making assumptions that the meaning of certain words is the same meaning, and not account for different communities will look at that word differently, right? So for example, you know, whether you're on the right side of the spectrum or the left side of the spectrum, I would say most people will agree that no child should die from random gun shooting, right? But as you take on the words in terms of how we report, right? The word gun violence, the word, where there's like gun violence or gun mitigation, or sort of like it take on different political bent. And sometimes we really conflate words that is already politicized, and we sort of like using it again and again to amplify, you know, some of these channel in ways that I don't think that we even consciously know, right? Because we say, oh, we're talking to this particular source, and this is the quote they use, but the word they use is already politicized, right? And so how do we actually contextualize that for the audience to know that, like, hey, you know, what they're talking about is gun prevention is not same as sort of you know, for some communities, like, is it the same? Is it different, right? And same with abortion, right? So in many, what I'm seeing now, in many of the issues that we are dealing with is the word itself have double meaning depending on which political spectrum you're in.
Right. People may understand those things differently, and then that plays a role for how people respond. Imran, is there anything you wanted to say on this topic?
I mean, I think that point of, you know, is there a technology that might be able to help us to a better technology than the current technology? The problem, as Paul really astutely acknowledged right at the beginning, is that technology is programmed by human beings. There's no such thing as a racist algorithm. There's a racist who programs an algorithm. Someone who doesn't care about the impact, the civil rights impact, or the impact of what it is that they're doing. They're not thinking about it. And that's a really good point for diversity within technology, for having a broader base of people thinking about things, for having more ethics in technology. There's no tech solution to the tech problems that we have here, because they're not technology problems, they're ethical problems, they're moral problems. They're questions of what we choose to profit from, what we choose to accept.
But are they also national problems? Because I just hate to say it, but I'm going to use the US and not the UK, since I you know, have traveled in the UK, but I'm not an expert. But I'm an expert in the US. I lived here all my life. When people turn to violence, there's a tendency for people to characterize that as like against the national, like as deviant from the dominant norms of the nation, right? And thus we turn to social media to explain why someone turned to violence, why someone was radicalized, when in fact, much of the kind of violence that has occurred in the US is violence that's consistent with what the American empire has espoused for most of its careers. You know, it was like, right now, the federal government of the US has been forced to admit that right-wing extremist violence is the biggest threat, right? And the people who exhibit this threat are saying things that have been said and taught even in school and legislated for most of American history. So, you know, long before social media was present. So I just wonder if that is also, I don't know if you feel like that's at work in the UK, but I just wonder what happens when we begin to narrate these things as,
of course, and I completely agree with you that actually those ideas are, I mean, I'm sorry, but any sort of crazy notion in American culture, we Brits had it first. You're speaking to the OGs of white supremacism.
Yes.
And class distinction here, believe me. I agree with you, but what has the history of the last 200 years been, if nothing else than the gradual opening up of society to more diversity and voices, the liberalization and the increase in tolerance? Like, it would be impossible in most spaces in which we exist in the world today to use, for example, the N-word, and for that to be acceptable. You'd get sacked from your job. I would certainly sack you if you worked for me. You'd be kicked out of a pub if you started shouting it. You'd be kicked out of almost any social, physical situation. But online, it's absolutely tolerated because hate is a virus that looks for a vulnerable host. And right now it's found somewhere where it can breed, and if it finds a space to breed, it will infect the rest of offline society as well. It has that re-socializing effect as well. What is the stagnant pool in which this pathogen is breeding today? It's taking advantage of the fact that social media offers essentially ungoverned spaces with no immune system that's there to try and deal with the proliferation of hatred, that imposes no consequences, in which hate actors can act with impunity. And of course, Musk has taken that to the nth degree, because he basically put up the bat signal and said, come on in, guys, my platform's open to you. And what happened? I mean, CCDH showed recently in research that's been published really extensively that there was a tripling overnight, a tripling in the volume of use of the N-word on Twitter after Musk took over. 3 times as much. It's just a staggering change. A massive increase in use of homophobic slurs, transphobic slurs, anti-Semitic slurs. It is about the spaces in which these can exist. And the problem that we have is that is rewarded with insane wealth. So the truth is that the people that have administered these completely laissez-faire platforms that actually are skewed towards hate rather than tolerance, Mark Zuckerberg is worth $100 billion, and he's younger than I am.
Right.
Why would he change his business models or his algorithms? They're brilliant. He's super rich, and we've rewarded him. And in fact, we cheer him and take his tainted blood money from his foundation.
Yeah, I think I really agree with what you're saying. And so I just want to take a minute, because we only have a few minutes left, but we have such interesting comments coming in. So we don't have a chance to read all the questions, but I'm going to read a few comments that have come here. There are some folks who want, there's some questions about how we even define civility that have come up. There is one interesting question about is there a chance that legislation would be able to get through that could hold some of these platforms accountable? Some people have echoed the comments you've made about how social media is constructed as an ideal environment. So I just wanted to acknowledge those. There's one point, though, that I'd like to link up that was brought up by someone that described digital advertising, right? How do we get the industry to admit that the digital ads in some ways are the problem? I mean, both of you have alluded to this. And how do we get people to realize that the digital money, there's no money really available for the quality of content that they want, right? And it's, so I guess and I, as somebody who's a media scholar, right, who knows like a sort of set of political economists who talk about this, I am interested in how we kind of foreground those questions. Is that something that you all could respond to at all?
So this is really funny. I've been thinking a lot about the business of journalism, right? So especially in the age of the internet. And so when you think about advertising business, the business of journalism for a while is this finite way of how money get made, no matter what sector you're in. Either a advertiser, a sponsor, or foundation pay for it, or the consumer pay for it, right? That's only two ways that how any company makes money. Historically, media, including journalism, is a business of eyeballs, right? For advertisers, they really don't care who they're advertising. Whoever gives them the most amount of eyeballs wins the advertising business, right? For a while, newspaper won that business, right? Because they are not just the content provider, but they're also the distributor, right? They basically own the distribution channel and the content creation at the same time. So you see the proliferation of news from, Pulitzer and Hearst all the way up to pre-internet. When internet happened, it decoupled that, right? So the content creator is no longer own the distribution. It becomes the technology. So the question that we have to ask for journalism is, what is the business we're in? Are we still in the eyeball business? Because if we're in the eyeball business, there could be winners in journalism, but it wouldn't be winners like me at the Center for Public Integrity. The winners are the New York Times and the Washington Post and the CNN and Fox News in the world, because internet as a business model favors scale, right? They have to scale and they have to reach to continue to grow. So when I think about the Center for Public Integrity, we do long-form investigative journalism. My business is not in the business of eyeball. We are in the business of equity, right? Our preferred tactic is using journalism as a way to reverse the effects of inequality. But if you talk to most newsrooms, they don't think of themselves as a different business, except for eyeball business, right? So if I were to think about the local news, I have to really ask myself is, what business am I in? Am I in the news of getting local eyeballs, or am I actually in a different space? Just like your favorite like artisanal like coffee place, right? So I think right now, a lot of journalism is asking these fundamental questions because the dynamic of money doesn't change. Someone has to pay for it, right? So it's a mix of, are we in the right kind of business to even education? So my question for the group is, how many of you actually have donated to a nonprofit news? How many of you actually subscribe to your local news that is not the New York Times or the Washington Post, right? If you haven't, you have a role to play in it, right? You want quality news, you got to pay for it. But I'm sure you'd rather pay for Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime than, subscribing to like 5 local news.
Well, thank you for this comment. I hate to have to do this, but we're kind of at our time and I want to be respectful of time. Thank you so much for this. I think we probably need to come back with a part 2 because I see the comments exploding. People are still here. I know Imran's over there with more to say. So what I just want to, I do want to say that someone has asked if there are organizations working on this, and there are a number of organizations that are. 2 of them, though, are right here with us: the Center for Public Integrity, the Center for Countering Digital Hate in the US and the UK. So I think that, I would encourage you to go to those organizations. You can reach out to us, you can reach out to me on Twitter, catch a tweet down, or just email me. And, it's like, I just want to thank everyone. And once again, thank you to the Bradamus Center for giving us space for such an important, urgent, and robust discussion. And, we'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.